set in stone. I think fiscal pressures, as I said, I don't want to comment on that too long, but I think that you will agree that, yeah, that means people getting creative. Creative in the sense of, okay, how can we push some of the responsibilities to the citizens? I will come back on that. And of course, technology. After yesterday's fantastic presentation and question and answers at the dinner yesterday, you've seen that. No, there is a temptation that technology is being seen, I mean, in particular, communication could be an instrument that you use as politician. Apparently, there is a tendency to think that it's a one-way street, but it isn't. It is not. And we have seen that it's a two-way street. And it doesn't come back exactly in the way that you want it. Much less predictable. We've said, yes, fiscal pressures can increase creative, innovative thinking. But please look at that. What this says, measures in fiscal consolidation plans. What do you see? Most of all is wage cuts. Reducing the number of people who work there in the public sector. And there are a few that have actually thought about redefining standards and making changes to the organization within the government. I think this is a very clear indication fiscal pressures translate into two measures in particular: cuts in wages and reductions in the number of people who work in the government. These are the numbers of countries that have done it pretty strong. I'd say that there is, of course, the other side that I would say, would I like to, sorry, does it work? What are the factors that lead to greater distance? I think there's a certain tendency to be individualized in our current societies. Not surprisingly, in a prosperous environment, you think that you are better on your own. But governments also have done a lot to encourage that thinking. Today you are encouraged in most countries, think about your pensions for yourself, education of your children for yourself, and if possible, health. Certainly you're responsible for it. So if you think that you are pushed into this direction, with one of the great exceptions, of course, the United States healthcare reform that seemed to be saying we're catching up. But generally, there is that tendency that you can observe. So it means, citizens have become very sophisticated customers. Don't be surprised that they are very sophisticated citizens. They have their preferences, they have their choices, they are used to be able to make these choices very easily. So exit and choice is not something that you have a lot in the public sector, but it is going there. But once again, I would submit, for those who are doing well, that's actually a good choice. The crisis has, however, generated a lot of people who are less well-to-do these days, and the high unemployment rates that you see in many countries, persisting high unemployment rates, make sure that those people have not necessarily the choice of going elsewhere. So I think there is some closer look to do at what kind of citizens are we talking about. If you think of the long-term unemployment that the United States is registering these days among, in particular, the young and the old, not the middle, but among the young and the old, it says those people are depending a lot on support by governments. The multitude of service providers, I think this is a very important subject. You can go these days to various places to get excellent education. You can have very good health care. As long as you are able to pay, you have these choices much better at hand than it was ever before. The private sector has moved into it anyway. And you can see this is not just a national phenomenon, it is really everywhere, even at an international scale. Some of the countries are in the developing world presenting themselves as excellent healthcare providers. If you can pay, you can go there, and you can, I'm sure, get the right service. I would like to say something about confidentiality and transparency, but let me be short here because of the time. I just think it is important to realize that, yes, the way to hold governments to account is to have access to information. And this is a very detailed presentation. Let's just take the important thing. Yes, freedom of information exists. The real question is how accessible and how easily accessible is the information on governments. And there, the results are perhaps less, I would say, less convincing. There is more to be done. Therefore, last point that I had was the question about do we know, and I think we have spoken about it, we need to be a bit more analytic, a bit more inquisitive about understanding which of the clients we're talking about, which of the citizens we're talking about, and is it possible to have the same answers for all kinds of citizens and individual situations? I doubt it. Therefore, I think yesterday we heard the clear principle. It's not only those who would like to engage, the question is also, are they able to engage? Are they able to engage? And that, we saw it, has something to do with income structures. It has something to do with educational levels. And certainly it has something to do with the economic situation that individuals are facing. Interesting to see when we look at who is actually proposing what we call partnerships, and look at that, mostly comes from government. Within government, there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. When you look at those who use it, and even less for citizens, it doesn't seem to be quite the case. So maybe we have there a problem of a certain supply not meeting quite the demand. If I look at what we could draw from this, I would say, it says here, anticipate and understand. But I think anticipate and understand is not just the demand, it's also anticipate what kind of economic and social situation we'll find. And we would be well advised to be flexible when it comes to reacting to different situations. If you were going through another very difficult global period of economic distress, I am convinced that the answers of the subject here today, how do we engage more and better, is probably going to be a bit different as if we were in a period of economic growth and well-being. And I think the same is true that you would find out where and how citizens would like to engage. Provide framework conditions. By what do I mean? I think we need to be sure that we don't forget that certain principles of the public service are not debatable. Accountability has to be there, integrity has to be there. So we have to do a lot more in this area to make sure that we're also prepared for the responses. And yes, align expectations, I would say this is critical. That we make sure that we really see what we can deliver in a different world. And money, I'm sorry to come back to it, money makes a difference. If we have none, we may have to look for other solutions than if it were plenty. I think it's a very constraining but very important factor. And believe me, we should avoid this little situation by which we are ending up that someone will pick up the father and mother in this situation. Thank you very much.
Now, as usual, we've got some times for questions. We've got some speakers. We've got some questions in the audience. I might just start off on one because you triggered a bit of an idea there near the end. I've just come back from 3 months in Italy where I've got a position. I'm a professor at Bologna University, the biggest and best in Italy. And what's interesting there is they're going through a period of what I call stagnation in the iron cage. For 2 years now, I've observed the iron cage of no funding, no promotion. The bureaucracy is just overwhelming. And most of my colleagues there are very, very depressed. How do we actually get in that situation, which is a very European situation now, sweeping through many of the southern countries, how do we get innovation back into the public services and how do we get engagement back in there?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's true. Maybe the European situation is particularly dramatic, but it's not the only one. I mean, you would also see the United States, as we all can observe these days, but also the Japanese are coping or trying to cope with unprecedented debt levels. So yes, that is not a feature of a specific group of countries. Second, I think that especially if you take the Italian situation, what you can see is that the government has only relatively reluctantly, I'd say, acknowledged that savings have to be made. They made 2 weeks ago a proposal to get savings out of the system of about 40 billion for a country of the size of Italy. That's a beginning, I would say. There are very interesting examples of the leadership, especially the people who are responsible for the public administration. Interesting, you know what they started with? They started with reintroducing some sort of discipline in the public sector. And believe me, that's what I think we need to keep in mind. Be prepared ourselves. Be prepared to take this task on. For example, they made really a major reform in human resources policies in the public sector, a very important one, whereby the status of a permanent employment would be very much reduced, and especially senior people would be confronted with contractual relationships that need to be renewed if performance is satisfactory. That's something that in other countries, of course, is something which you take for granted, but it isn't. So I think that's a preparatory step. There is also a great move towards decentralization. It's another way to get innovation going. We don't have there the situation as yesterday Don, I think, was saying. We don't have 78,000 governments in Italy, but definitely there is an effort or an attempt made to broaden responsibilities across the country. And thirdly, performance management, the issue of making sure that the civil service is not just looking at what the input would be, but what is produced and make it measurable. Again, that reform got an enormous boost because of these shortages of resources. Now, does that mean that innovation in the public sector takes place? Certainly. Maybe a bit in compared to you and your, especially the Australian, New Zealanders, as the drivers of these reforms early on. For you, it seems like, okay, this is a bit of the past. We have done that already. But it underlines the point that financial resources play an important role in the reality of public sector reform. Everyone